Welcome to the Executive Insights Podcast, brought to you by AWS. I'm Clark Rogers, Director of Enterprise Strategy, and I'll be your guide through a series of conversations with security leaders. My guest today is Alec Peterson, former Vice President of Business Resilience at AWS. Join us for our discussion as we dive deep into what business resilience is, how it can be a competitive advantage, and its parallels with security investments throughout the enterprise. Enjoy. Alec, thanks so much for joining me today on Conversations with Security Leaders.
Great to be here, Clark. Thanks for having me.
Broadly, resilience is a balance, right? It's a balance of how much do you want to invest to make sure that nothing ever bad happens.
That's right.
But ultimately, something bad will happen to most organizations. How do we think about and invest in resilience at AWS?
So the first thing that we do is we operate under the premise that things are going to fail. There are going to be power events. We do an immense amount of innovation in our power infrastructure to ensure that our power is resilient, but those things are going to happen. So it starts by acknowledging that there will be failures, and then thinking about how do we make our building blocks and ultimately allow our customers to make their workloads resilient to those failures. And that starts from the foundation. So for instance, when we launched AWS, we pioneered the concept of availability zones. So the notion of a cluster of one or more data centers that have their own isolated power, their own network connectivity, their own cooling, their own buildings. A data center will only ever be part of a single availability zone. And then those availability zones are then grouped together to form a region. Mm-hmm. So every region has three or more availability zones, and those again are isolated. So you'll have the availability zone concepts and constructs that are isolated to that zone. There are some services such as Amazon S3, which provides object storage to customers. That service is a regional service. So that service is built across availability zones, and we take care of managing any sort of impairment in an availability zone on behalf of customers. But then that is limited to a region. So we think about it in terms of starting from that infrastructure and then building these services that take those infrastructure boundaries into account, and thinking about what will happen if a failure happens within one of those boundaries, and then managing it accordingly.
What, if any, intersection is there between resilience and security? When we think about security, we have that CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Mm-hmm. I would think there's a heavy crossover in availability and resilience.
Yeah, I see availability as the result of resilience.
Okay.
Right. Resilience is an action that one takes to think about what is the potential failure modes that I want to be resilient to. How should my workload behave when those happen? Should it handle them seamlessly? Should it degrade? That's going to vary depending on the nature of the workload. But the availability is that result. Right. So in the event for a particular failure mode, if the workload expects that to be transparent, the availability under nominal circumstances versus in a failure scenario would be the same, right? But if there's a scenario where you might expect some degradation, that would then potentially affect that availability outcome based on whatever the needs of the business are.
Customers are very familiar with the concept of business continuity planning and disaster recovery, and they often have to test their systems to see how they'll stand up to failure. What are some of the things that AWS does to validate the integrity of their systems?
Well, one of the core premises we operate from when it comes to resilience is that any sort of resilience to a potential failure that is not tested is very limited in value. So the ultimate proof of resilience ultimately comes from demonstration of the ability to recover or to be resilient to that impairment. So for instance, one of the things we will do is prior to the launch of a new AWS region, we will conduct what we call game days.
Okay.
Prior to any customers being in that region. But after we have completely built the region, we will do things to that infrastructure, such as turn off the power or isolate the network, or perhaps other sorts of scenarios within our software, in order to exercise failure modes that we expect the system to be resilient to, and then validate that it actually behaves the way it does.
That's incredible.
Yeah, this is a really helpful exercise so that we can understand how the system actually behaves in times of stress by actually putting that stress on it.
Back to customers again. Resilience has become a hot topic in the board of directors. Typically, it's been aligned to what's going to happen to us if we fall victim to a ransomware attack
Sure.
or a DDoS attack. Are you involved in any of those types of conversations with customers, and how do you address them?
So honestly, most of those conversations tend to focus more on the security side, but there is absolutely obviously a resilience angle to that, and there is clearly a relationship between resilience and security. Depending on what way you look at it, one could see resilience as a subset of security, or security as a subset of resilience, but they are certainly related. So in terms of recovering from something like a ransomware attack, the importance there is first and foremost keep it from happening.
Sure.
Right. Like that's obviously where it has to start. But again, being resilient to that failure requires one to consider, okay, assume they've gotten in there. And that's where the isolation of any sort of ransomware system, and any sort of system that would be required to recover from the ransomware, such as backups, redundant systems, is completely separated so that lateral movement that was clearly possible because of the fact that the ransomware attack was successful hits that wall and doesn't affect that other system. And that gets back to the point I was making before, that that one needs to make sure that you are thinking about what the blast radius is and how one could contain that truly a bad event.
And do you often see with customers that resiliency planning is a parallel to incident response planning? Is it part of it? Where do you see customers focusing on it?
Resilience is central to incident response. It obviously depends on the type of incident one is responding to, right? If it's some sort of a security compromise or something like that, that would drive a different sort of response than, say, a natural disaster or power failure or something like that. But having a common incident response methodology and making sure that whatever the coordination point for that incident response is well plugged into whatever sort of outcome one needs to drive based on the scenario is very important. Different organizations handle it in different ways. At Amazon, we actually do have separate security incident response teams from our more, I guess what I'll call operational incident response teams. Though obviously security is operational, but non-security operational.
Sure.
Right. So the event, there is a power event, there is some sort of a failure. We have a team that is laser focused purely on those operational events. And it allows us to separate those work streams, which we have found to be helpful.
And I imagine those teams are also involved in the sort of game day scenarios that you mentioned earlier as far as developing them.
Oh, they're central, not only developing them, but obviously participating in them because they are incidents. So we actually mandate that our teams treat any sort of game day recovery as a regular event.
Got it.
One of the things that we found that can happen is without that, the response can say, oh, well, it's a game day. So, I've got some development tasks to work on. Obviously, if there's an actual customer event going on, that will supersede a game day. But in the event that there is the only incident response happening at the time is for the game day, that needs to be handled just like it is a customer impacting event, because that is the point of the exercise.
So finding, training, and hiring new talent is a constant challenge, right? Mm-hmm. What are some of the qualities that you're looking for a resilience hire in your organization?
In something like resilience, as with security, I mean, one could ask for the moon,
right?
And frankly, probably come up with a pretty reasonable argument that it should be justified, but we are ultimately here to deliver the business value for our customers, and resilience and security are important pieces of that, but those alone do not deliver that value. So finding ones who can have that balance between those leadership principles of moving fast, but also having a high standard and diving deep into those details is a good balance to have in terms of being able to thread that needle and deal with the ambiguous space that is resilience.
And you did mention there the sort of crossover and similarities between the stresses of the job in both security and resilience. How do you manage burnout in your teams?
Yeah, one could look at security and resilience jobs cynically and say their success is defined by the absence of failure.
Right.
And there is some truth to that. But at the same time, we have to focus on celebrating our successes. Right. So, for instance, when we do have an event that never happened or never exposed customers to any sort of impact because of the resilience improvements that we did, we celebrate that. So we regularly celebrate wins where the redundancy that we put into the system actually delivers on its value. And the other thing that we do is when something goes wrong, we focus obsessively over learning. Whenever we have a process at Amazon called the correction of error process. It's our post-mortem process that we do after any sort of event. And it is a rigorous and deep process. But there are a few things that it is known for. It is known for what we call the 5 whys. So you start with the initial impact and say, why did that happen? Well, there were errors. Okay, why were there errors? Well, the disk filled up. Why did the disk fill up? And on and on and on and on until you get to that. But the other thing that it is notorious for is human error is never the root cause.
Interesting.
We put a human in a position to cause some sort of impact. That is a failure of the business. That is a failure of our product to put the human in a position to do that. Now, obviously, if there are policy violations and anything like that, that's not a correction of error. That's a different sort of process. But I'm talking about a situation where an engineer, an operator, a human is put in a position to do something, and they were in a position to make a mistake they really shouldn't have been in a position to make. So many of the actions that we talk about taking in response to COEs are ones where we focus on how to improve the system so that the human is never put in that position in the first place. We have to be paranoid. We have to have a really high bar, but knowing that that's how the process works, and that, I have seen so many promotions come out of how individuals have responded to an event, whether they were involved in it or not.
Right.
I have never seen anybody have any sort of discipline, certainly not be terminated due to an operational event. And people know that. And knowing that allows people to kind of maintain that balance.
I imagine that element of psychological safety allows you to actually even dive deeper into some of these problems as you're investigating them.
That's exactly right, because the purpose is truth seeking. It's a core part of our DNA at Amazon is being vocally self-critical.
Yep.
So that self-criticality and being openly critical about where mistakes were made is frankly rewarded versus any sort of concern about what the consequences for being self-critical are. In fact, where one could perhaps get some harder questions is when they are not being self-critical. So it helps drive that behavior of truly being driven towards truth-seeking and doing the right thing.
Got it. What advice would you give customers as they're thinking about resilience for their business?
There's a few things you want to think about. First of all, what I mentioned earlier about the availability zones and thinking about the infrastructure fault domains, using those as part of your plan is very important. And understanding how those are designed to contain failure, and then how workloads moving across them or that are sharing them and then removing one from service is a very important piece of that, because that's a key part of the response and of the resilience strategy. And the second is, assume the failure is going to happen, right? One has to really operate under the assumption that the failure is going to happen, and managing those expectations with the business. One of the conversations I often have with customers is if they're looking to build a completely redundant system and say they want to be resilient to some sort of failure, they immediately jump to, gosh, that could double my infrastructure cost.
Right.
Well, it could, but if one has to replicate every bit of their infrastructure. But in practice, what we find is the functionality customers truly need to be resilient to the failures they have in mind is actually only a small subset of their infrastructure. So by tiering those workloads and understanding what those critical parts of the business are, it does a couple of things. First of all, it does a great job of managing cost. Right. Second of all, it forces those hard conversations about what is important to the business. And the third thing it does is it says that once you've identified those workloads, one can then manage that expectation with the business of what the customer experience will be in a degraded scenario. Because one of the truisms of any sort of operational event is if something's going wrong and you're impaired, chances are they're guaranteed the team is already working on fixing it.
Right.
But chances also are the team doesn't know how long it's going to take. It's the most common question I get asked during an incident, and the answer virtually always is, I honestly don't know. And we're working as fast as we can on it. But that's obviously what the business wants to know.
Sure.
Right. So if the business instead of saying, well, it has to get back to exactly the way it was before, instead of saying, okay, I'm in a degraded state. Here's my run book for how to operate in this degraded state. I have plans to do this for the next 12 hours. Say, I should be fine for that long. Then the team can manage that. And then it can obviously look at the postmortem and figure out how to make sure it doesn't happen again. But it allows the business to operate through that event as a planned event, as a planned disruption, because you plan for it, you exercised that, as opposed to having the business always assume that the skies are always going to be sunny, because they're not by definition.
So it sounds to me like a lot of this is a risk management exercise. So if I'm a customer and I'm new to AWS, or maybe I've even been in AWS for quite some time, I'm operating in one or more availability zones in a region. And then due to some risk management exercise, I determined that being in one region is quote unquote too risky. So now I'm going to spread my workloads across multiple regions. Let's just say 2 for this example.
Sure.
What stops that risk management professional from sort of blowing out every bad scenario that could happen, and then all of a sudden they say, well, the only way I feel comfortable is to run in every region all the time?
Well, it is a bit of a slippery slope, as you say, going down that road. And it gets back to being realistic about what the scenarios one is wants to prevent against and deal with, but also being realistic about what the cost of that additional redundancy is. And it is not just the infrastructure cost, right? There is additional cost to just managing a system across say multiple regions.
Sure.
2, 3, 5. It's going from 1 to 2 is actually the biggest jump.
Okay.
Right. And for a lot of customers, for some customers, that is the right decision. But one risks by spreading the workload across multiple regions. One risks actually potentially focusing too much on a potential a catastrophic scenario, such as the impairment of a region, which has a very low likelihood. But by doing that and spreading that across multiple regions, the workload could potentially be more susceptible to less severe failures. For instance, it now relies on the network in between the regions as well as each region themselves to be operating perfectly.
Got it.
Mathematically, that is more opportunity for some sort of issue to happen. Those situations can all be dealt with, but that is development time. That is infrastructure cost. That is management of that blast radius, right? Like you'd have to then be very careful about managing your changes within each one of those to not have something that you would potentially, that a customer would potentially do to cause an issue across all of those. So there are certain customers, we have customers who do it very successfully, but it is certainly not for every customer. So it's important to think very objectively about what the risks and that we're trying to mitigate versus what the cost of actually implementing that is, versus saying, okay, maybe this is a risk given the low likelihood and the fact that it is going to be addressed in a certain period of time. It's one that the certain parts of the business, or perhaps the whole business, we just decide would be acceptable.
Got it. And I imagine there's a thread here around the customer shared responsibility model as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So in AWS security, we have the shared responsibility model where AWS is responsible for security of the cloud. So securing our data centers, securing our services, providing customers with the building blocks they need to build that secure application. And then customers are then responsible for their security in the cloud. Resilience is exactly the same. We are responsible for the resilience of the cloud, but then providing customers with the tools to then manage that resilience of their application in the cloud.
When customers start making investments in new programs, they often have to show value very quickly in order to continue to get those investment dollars. How does one start off building a resilience program and then demonstrating that value?
It can be challenging, especially if one is starting, you're never starting from zero when it comes to resilience, but when one's looking at a destination that's very far away and potentially many years and many dollars involved in delivering on it, it can seem daunting to look at making that investment as a whole. So the success that I've seen takes a couple steps. The first is to get general alignment on that end. Right. Starting with the senior leaders saying, look, we want to get here. I'm not asking you just to write me a check yet, but just agree that we all want to get there. So start with that indisputable outcome one wants to get to. And then say, okay, let's not look at our entire business. Let's look at either an area that is particularly painful. This is one that actually recency bias can help. Right. So if there's been a pain with a particular workload or a particular one that's happened recently, that's a great way a great place to start.
Right.
And then take that long vision, but don't apply it to the whole business. Apply it to that one piece, but only focus it there. So then once it delivers, you can compare with the rest of the business and then see, okay, yes, that value's there. And then what you'll probably decide is you don't have to apply it to the entire business. You say, oh, there are these sorts of problems, these sorts of parts of my business that are shaped in a similar way that I could apply it to get to that outcome. In the end, you might end up applying it everywhere, but that incremental approach is very helpful. It's one we take all the time at Amazon in terms of just making incremental progress, putting one foot in front of the other towards the end that is really non-negotiable and clear, but then allowing us a lot of flexibility in terms of the near-term steps being taken.
So when we think about resilience as a business inside of AWS, you obviously have responsibilities to report up and out to the health of the business. How do you go about doing that?
Well, first of all, the great part about my role is it's a business made up of all of the businesses within AWS, and it's absolutely a partnership. So I'm very fortunate to have strong partnerships with the entirety of the AWS service leadership, because ultimately what I'm reporting on is fundamentally everything they're doing. And I'm just pulling that together and helping to drive alignment on what outcomes we're going after, and in a lot of cases, working to frankly remove roadblocks or potentially provide justification for resilience improvements that teams might try to do. But at some point, we have to be able to answer the question, how is AWS doing?
Sure.
Right? So there's a few ways that we do that. Tactically, every week, all of AWS meets. So we have a weekly operations meeting every week for 2 hours, Wednesday from 9 to 11 a.m. And our most senior infrastructure and services leadership are there inspecting the business. So on a week-to-week basis, that's how our leadership is staying in touch with what is actually happening on a very tactical level and getting very far down into the details of what's happening with services, reviewing events that may have happened, as well as inspecting services, looking at their metrics dashboards and so forth. That's pretty tactical, right? Looking at it week over week, you could have a few months and things could be kind of quiet. You could say, hey, we're doing great. And then you could have 1 or 2 weeks where there might be a couple of near misses or something and say, oh my goodness, there's some challenges. So taking that step back, something that we spent a bit of time thinking about. And what we realized is, first of all, we really looking at it more granularly than say once every 3 or 6 months isn't very helpful, right? Okay. You want to look at it and take a step back and look at what's happening over time to avoid over-rotating on individual ones. The second thing we do is we focus as much as possible on output metrics.
Okay.
So we focus on ultimately what our customers are telling us about the impact they are seeing from any sort of availability issues within AWS. So we've identified some thresholds where we consider a certain level of impairment, and we also look at just how often customers open support cases related to issues with AWS services. So we look at those outputs and we look at that over time. And at the same time, we also pair those with the inputs that we are driving, the resilience improvements that we are driving, in order to kind of see over time, are the inputs that we have conviction will improve that experience for our customers are driving the correct output.
Got it.
And a key part of that is that those reviews that we do every 3 or 6 months are reviewed with the AWS and Amazon CEOs. So we are amazing. Very fortunate that our leadership is so focused on this that their time is hard to get, and we are very fortunate that they spend a big chunk of their time every few months inspecting this to really reinforce for the business just how important it is.
That's fantastic to hear. If I change that question a little bit from the customer perspective, so 2 questions here. Do you see a senior leadership role around resilience in a lot of the customers you talk to? And the second part of that is, how are the customers typically reporting internally the health of the business? Are they doing something similar to what you just articulated?
I haven't seen 2 customers that do it the same way, much less that do it the way that we do. The way that we report on this at Amazon is driven by how Amazon is structured.
Sure.
Right. So it follows very much about how we operate. We are passionate about our single-threaded ownership model and the way that we drive things, but it works for us.
Right.
Right. So the outcome that I think is most important is really making sure that there is that attention at some level on resilience. How it reports up, how that gets to the senior leadership, I found is less important than just making sure that it actually happens and that the business is seeing the right outcomes in terms of resilience from their customers.
Got it.
Right. Whether that's happening through some sort of formal process, whether there are anecdotes that are being reported on, whether it's surveys. Like, there are a lot of ways to get that information, but just the more the customers actually focus on that and are self-critical about how it can be improved, those are the ones that I've seen be most successful.
That's great to hear. Alec, thanks so much for joining me today.
Great to be here, Clark. Thanks for having me.